Plutarch's Morals on Education, Section 1. Come, let us consider what one might say on the education of free children, and by what training they would become good citizens. Section 2. It is perhaps best to begin with birth. I would therefore warn those who desire to be fathers of notable sons not to form connections with any kind of woman, such as courtesans or mistresses, for those who either on the father or mother's side are ill born have the disgrace of their origin all their life long, irretrievably present with them, and offer a ready handle to abuse and vituperation. So that the poet was wise who said, unless the foundation of a house be well laid, the descendants must of necessity be unfortunate. Good birth indeed brings with it a store of assurance, which ought to be greatly valued by all who desire legitimate offspring. For the spirit of those who are a spurious and bastard breed is apt to be mean and abject. For as the poet truly says, it makes a man even of noble spirit servile, when he is conscious of the ill fame of either his father or mother. On the other hand, the sons of illustrious parents are full of pride and arrogance. As an instance of this is recorded of Diophantus, the son of Themistocles, that he often used to say to various people that he could do what he pleased with the Athenian people, for what he wished his mother wished, and what she wished Themistocles wished, and what Themistocles wished all the Athenians wished. All praise also ought we to bestow on Lacedaemonians or Lacedaemonians for their loftiness of soul in finding their king Archidamus for venturing to marry a small woman, for they charged him with intending to furnish them not with kings but with kinglets. Section 3. Now we must mention what was not overlooked even by those who handled this subject before us, that those who approach their wives for procreation must do so either without having drunk any wine, or at least very little. For those children that their parents begot in drink are wont to be fond of wine and apt to turn out drunkards. And so Diogenes, seeing a youth out of his mind and crazy, said, young man, your father was drunk when he begot you. Let this hint serve as to procreation. Now let us discuss education. Section 4. To speak generally, what we are wont to say about the arts and sciences is also true of moral excellence. For to its perfect development, three things must meet together: natural ability, theory, and practice. By theory I mean training, and by practice working at one's craft. Now the foundation must be laid in training, and practice gives facility, but perfection is attained only by the junction of all three. For if any one of these elements be wanting, excellence must be so far deficient. For natural ability without training is blind, and training without natural ability is defective, and practice without both natural ability and training is imperfect. For just as in farming, the first requisite is good soil, next a good farmer, next good seed. So also here, the soil corresponds to natural ability, the training to the farmer, the seed to precepts and instruction. I should therefore maintain stoutly that these three elements were found combined in the souls of such universally famous men as Pythagoras and Socrates and Plato, and of all who have won undying fame. Happy at any rate, and dear to the gods is he to whom any deity has vouchsafed all these elements. But if anyone thinks that those who have not good natural ability cannot, to some extent, make up for the deficiencies of nature by right training and practice, let such a one know that he is very wide of the mark, if not out of it altogether. For good natural parts are impaired by sloth, while inferior ability is mended by training, and while simple things escape the eyes of the careless, difficult things are reached by painstaking. The wonderful efficacy and power of long and continuous labor you may see indeed every day in the world around you. Thus water, continually dropping, wears away rocks, and iron and steel are molded by the hands of the artificer, and chariot wheels bent by some strain can never recover their original symmetry, and the crooked staves of actors can never be made straight. But, but by toil, what is contrary to nature becomes stronger than even nature itself. And are these the only things that teach the power of diligence? Not so. 10,000 things teach the same truth. A soil naturally good becomes by neglect barren, and the better its original condition, the worse its ultimate state if uncared for. On the other hand, a soil exceedingly rough and sterile, by being farmed well, produces excellent crops. And what trees do not by neglect become gnarled and unfruitful, whereas by pruning they become fruitful and productive? And what constitution so good, but it is marred and impaired by sloth, luxury, and too full habit? And what weak constitution has not derived benefit from exercise and athletics? And what horses broken in young are not docile to their riders? While if they are not broken in till late, they become hard-mouthed and unmanageable. And why should we be surprised at similar cases, seeing that we find many of the savagest animals docile and tame by training? Rightly answered the Thessalian, who was asked who the mildest Thessalians were, those who have done with fighting. But why pursue the line of argument further? For the Greek name for moral virtue is only habit, and if anyone defines moral virtues as habitual virtues, he will not be beside the mark. But I will employ only one more illustration and dwell no longer on this topic. Lycurgus, the Lacedaemonian legislator, took two puppies of the same parents and brought them up in an entirely different way. The one he pampered and cosseted up, while he taught the other to hunt and to be a retriever. Then on one occasion when the Lacedaemonian or the Lacedaemonians, were convened in assembly, he said, "Mighty O Lacedaemonians, is the influence on moral excellence of habit and education and training and modes of life, as I will prove to you at once." So saying, he produced the two puppies and set before them a platter and a hare. The one darted on the hare, while the other made for the platter. And when the Lacedaemonians could not guess what his meaning was, or with what intent he had produced the puppies, he said, "These puppies are the same. These puppies are of the same parents, but by virtue of a different bringing up, the one is pampered and the other a good hound." Let so much suffice for habits and modes of life. Section 5. The next point to discuss will be nutrition. In my opinion, mothers ought to nurse and suckle their own children, for they will bring them up with more sympathy and care if they love them so intimately and, as the proverb puts it, for from their first growing their nails. Whereas the affection of wet or dry nurses is spurious and counterfeit, being merely for pay. And nature itself teaches that mothers ought themselves to suckle and rear those they have given birth to. And for that purpose she has supplied every female parent with milk. And Providence has wisely provided women with two breasts, so that if they should bear twins, they would have a breast for each. And besides this, as is natural enough, they would feel more affection and love for their children by suckling them. For this supplying them with food is as it were a tightener of love. For even the brute creation, if taken away from their young, pine away, as we constantly see. Mothers must therefore, as I said, certainly try to suckle their own children, but if they are unable to do so either through physical weakness, for this contingency sometimes occurs, or in haste to have other children, they must select wet and dry nurses with the greatest care, and not introduce into their houses any kind of women. First and foremost, they must be Greek in their habits, for just as it is necessary immediately after birth to shapen the limbs of children, so that they may grow straight and not crooked, so from the beginning must their habits be carefully attended to, for infancy is supple and easily molded, and what children learn sinks deeply into their souls while they are young and tender, whereas everything hard is softened only with great difficulty. For just as seals are impressed on soft wax, so instruction leaves its permanent mark on the minds of those still young. And divine Plato seems to me to give excellent advice to nurses not to tell their children any kind of fables, that their souls may not in the very dawn of existence be full of folly or corruption. Phocylides, the poet, also seems to give admirable advice when he says, "We must teach good habits while the pupil is still a boy." Section 7. Next, when our boys are old enough to be put into the hands of tutors. Great care must be taken that we do not hand them over to conscripted laborers, or foreigners, or flighty persons. For what happens nowadays in many cases is highly ridiculous. Good laborers are made farmers, are sailors, are merchants, are stewards, are moneylenders, but if they find a wine-bibbing, greedy, and utterly useless laborer, to him parents commit the charge of their sons, whereas the good tutor ought to be such a one as was Phoenix, the tutor of Achilles. The point also which I am now going to speak about is of the utmost importance. The schoolmasters we ought to select for our boys should be of blameless life, of pure character, and of great experience, for a good training is the source and root of gentlemanly behavior. And just as farmers prop up their trees, so good schoolmasters prop up the young by good advice and suggestions that they may become upright. How one must despise, therefore, some fathers who, whether from ignorance or inexperience, before putting the intended teachers to the test, commit their sons to the charge of untried and untested men. If they act so through inexperience, it is not so ridiculous, but it is to the remotest degree absurd when, through perfectly, though perfectly, aware of both the inexperience and worthlessness of some schoolmasters, they yet entrust their sons to them. Some overcome by flattery, others to gratify friends who solicit their favors, acting just as if anybody ill in body, passing over the experienced physician, should, to gratify his friend, call him in, and so throw away his life. Or as if to gratify one's friend, one should reject the best pilot and choose him instead. Zeus and all the gods! Can anyone bearing the sacred name of father but obliging a petitioner before obtaining the best education for his sons? Were they not then wise words that the time honored Socrates used to utter, and say that he would proclaim, if he could, climbing up to the highest part of the city, Men, what can you be thinking of, who move heaven and earth to make money, while you bestow next to no attention on the sons you are going to leave that money to? I would add to this that such fathers act very similarly to a person who should be very careful about his shoe but care nothing about his foot. Many persons also are so stingy about their children and indifferent to their interests that for the sake of a paltry saving, they prefer worthless teachers for their children, practicing a vile economy at the expense of their children's ignorance. Apropos of this, Aristippus on one occasion rebuked an empty headed parent neatly and wittily. For being asked how much money a parent ought to pay for his son's education, he answered, 1,000 drachma. And he replying, Hercules, what a price! I could buy a robot for as much. Aristippus answered, You shall have two robots then, your son and the robot you buy. And is it not altogether strange that you accustom your son to take his food in his right hand and chide him if he offers his left, whereas you care very little about his hearing good and sound discourses? I will tell you what happens to such admirable fathers when they have educated and brought up their sons so badly. When the sons grow to man's estate, they disregard a sober and well ordered life and rush headlong into disorderly and low vices. Then at the last, the parents are sorry they have neglected their education, bemoaning bitterly when it is too late their son's debasement. For some of them keep flatterers and parasites in their retinue, an accursed set of wretches, the defilers and pests of youth. Others keep mistresses and common prostitutes, wanton and costly. Others waste their money in eating. Others come to grief through dice and reveling. Some even go in for bolder profligacy, being whoremongers and defilers of the marriage bed, who would madly pursue their darling vice if it cost them their lives. Had they associated with some philosopher, they would not have lowered themselves by such practices, but would have remembered the precepts of Diogenes, whose advice sounds rather low, but, in, but is really of excellent moral intent. Go into a brothel, my lad, that ye may see the little difference between vice and virtue. Section 8. I say, then, to speak comprehensibly, and I might be justly considered in so saying, to speak as an oracle, not to be delivering a mere precept, that a good education and sound bringing up is of the first and middle and last importance, and I declare it to be most instrumental and conducive to virtue and happiness. For all other human blessings compared to this are petty and insignificant. For noble birth is a great honor, but it is an advantage for our forefathers. And wealth is valuable, but it is the acquisition of fortune, who has often taken it away from those who had it, and brought it to those who little expected it. And much wealth is a sort of mark for villainous creatures and informers to shoot at to fill their own purses. And what is a most important point, even the greatest villains have money sometimes. And glory is noble but insecure, and beauty is highly desirable but short lived, and health is highly valuable but soon impaired. And strength is desirable, but illness or age soon made sad inroads into it. And generally speaking, if anyone prides himself on his bodily strength, let him know that he is deficient in judgment. For how much inferior is the strength of a man to that of animals, as elephants, bulls, and lions? But education is of all our advantages the only one immortal and divine. And two of the most powerful agencies in man's nature are mind and reason. And mind governs reason, and reason obeys mind, and mind is irremovable by fortune, cannot be taken away by informers, cannot be destroyed by disease, cannot have inroads made into it by old age, for the mind alone flourishes in age. And while time takes away everything else, it adds wisdom to old age.
even war, that sweeps away everything else like a winter torrent, cannot take away education. And still, Paul, the Magirian, seems to me to have made a memorable answer when Demetrius captured Megara and razed it to the ground. On his asking whether Stilpo had lost anything, he replied, "Certainly not, for war can make no havoc of virtue." Corresponding and consonant to this is the answer of Socrates, who, when asked, I think by Gorgias, if he had any conception as to the happiness of the king of Persia, replied, "I do not know his position in regard to virtue and education, for happiness lies in these, and not in adventitious advantages." Section 9. And as I advise parents to think nothing more important than the education of their children, so I maintain that it must be a sound and healthy education, and that our sons must be kept as far as possible from vulgar twaddle. For what pleases the vulgar displeases the wise. I am borne out by the lines of Euripides. Unskilled am I in the oratory that pleases the mob. But amongst the few that are my equals, I am reckoned rather wise. For those who are little thought of by the wise seem hit. For those who are little thought of by the wise seem to hit the taste of the vulgar. And I have myself noticed that those who practice to speak acceptably and to gratification of the masses promiscuously, for the most part, become also profligate and lovers of pleasure in their lives, naturally enough. For if in giving pleasure to others they neglect the noble, they would be hardly likely to put the lofty and sound above a life of luxury and pleasure, and to prefer moderation to delights. Yet what better advice could we give our sons than to follow this? Or to what could we better exhort them to accustom themselves? For perfection is only attained by neither speaking nor acting at random, as the proverb says, perfection is only attained by practice. Whereas extempore oratory is easy and facile, mere windbag, having neither beginning nor end, and besides their other shortcomings, extempore speakers fall into great disproportion and repetition, whereas a well considered speech preserves its due proportions. It is recorded by tradition that Pericles, when called on by the people for a speech, frequently refused on the plea that he was unprepared. Similarly, Demosthenes, his state rival, when the Athenians called upon him for his advice, refused to give it, saying, "I am not prepared." But this, you will say, perhaps, is mere tradition without authority. But in his speech against Midias, he plainly sets forth the utility of preparation, for he says, "I do not deny, men of Athens, that I have prepared this speech to the best of my ability, for I should have been a poor creature if, after suffering so much at his hands, and even still suffering, I had neglected how to plead my case. Not that I would altogether reject extempore oratory or its use in critical cases, but it should be used only as one would take medicine. Up indeed to man's estate I would have no extempore speaking. But when anyone's power of speech are rooted and grounded, then as emergencies call for it, I would allow his words to flow freely. For as those who have been for a long time in fetters stumble if unloosed, not being able to walk from being long used to their fetters, so those who for a long time have used compression in their words, if they are suddenly called upon to speak offhand, retain the same character of expression. But to let mere lads speak extempore is to give rise to acme of foolish talk. A wretched painter once showed Apelles, they say, a picture and said, I have just done it. Apelles replied, without your telling me, I should know it was painted quickly. I only wonder you haven't painted more such in the time. As then, for I now return from my digression, I advise to avoid stilted and bombastic language, so again do I urge to avoid a finical and petty style of speech, for tall talk is unpopular and petty language makes no impression. And as the body ought to be not only sound but in good condition, so speech ought to be not only not feeble but vigorous. For a safe mediocrity is indeed praised, but a bold venturesomeness is also admired. I am also of the same opinion with regard to the disposition of the soul, which ought to be neither audacious nor timid and easily dejected. For the one ends in impudence and the other in servility. But to keep in all things the mean between extremes is artistic and proper. And while I am still on the topic, I wish to give my opinion that I regard a monotonous speech first as no small proof of want of taste, next as likely to generate disdain, and certainly not to please long. For to harp on one string is always tiresome and brings satiety, whereas variety is pleasant always, whether to the ear or eye.